Thanks very much. And yeah, I'm not quite sure who wrote that blurb, but I am an outcome-focused transport economist. I'm not an engineer, as Bridget hinted at earlier. I'm an associate in the transaction advice team at Arup. And I'm going to talk to you about financing and funding regional transport in challenging times. Now, in a diversion from the planned talk, most of this is going to be about funding, not financing. The definition of the two is quite subtle, and anyone who wants to know a long-winded explanation of that can see me afterwards. And what it is the presentation is really introduction, as well as a call for more local funding and financing. There we go. So, I'm going to talk to you about how tough the times are for regional cities. I'm going to talk to you about how centralised we are, with a particular focus on the UK, and sort of picking up some of the points that Bridget made earlier. I'm going to talk about what factors are at play in getting schemes approved and funded in that centralised system. And you're all going to give a big groan, because I'm going to talk about Crossrail again, which you've heard lots and lots of things about earlier today. And then I'm going to talk about future changes that might impact on changing the funding and financing opportunities in the UK context. So, to kick us off, just a few graphs that many of you are probably familiar with, and I'll whiz through these. In the UK, you can see that times, this graph is showing, if you like, the distance between the capital city of the country and the regional cities. And you can see that from this, in the UK, in the last 10 or 15 years, times for regional cities have been tough, but not that tough. The larger the bar on this graph, the further the capital broke away from the rest of the country in terms of GDP. And you can see the UK sort of in the middle, with London, making a bit of an advance on the regions. Germany is on the left there, which is probably a sort of legacy, I guess, of federalisation, and where the regions are doing much better than the capital, and Greece and Bulgaria there are on the right. The next graph is showing how UK cities have fared in the last recession. So this is a number of cities, hand-picked, if you like, not to show any particular point, and not hand-picked by me, I should say. And again, the further above zero the graph is, the better the city has fared in the last recession. Now, again, London has fared just above average. Belfast has done extremely well, which one might call a bit of bounce back, I suppose. Nottingham has not done particularly well at all. And the interesting thing for me about this graph is that there's not really that much of a sort of geographical relationship in terms of a north-south divide in terms of how the cities have fared. The regions have had very mixed fortunes economically, and there is great deviation between the regions. The other thing to note about this graph is that many regions that are not shown here have had a much worse time in the recession than the ones that are shown here. Final graph, I promise you. Oh, sorry, it's the second to last graph. This is showing the extent to which spending power is devolved outside of central government. And this is a graph taken from the Heseltine review. The UK, again, is in the middle, and the Heseltine review graph shows that about 25 to 30% of UK spending is spent non-centrally. Personally, and I think lots of other people think this as well, that's an overestimate as to what is raised and spent locally, and some estimates suggest between around 5 to 7% in the UK is raised and spent locally. And now this really is the final graph, I promise you, and the end of the scene setting. Again, this shows London and the rest of the UK in terms of the regional differences of the gross value added by the different regions between 1990 and 2010. This is the contribution to GDP of London and the regions, and although, as we showed before, although the capital's had a slightly better recession than many cities, its wealth and the division between, oh sorry, I've got the wrong graph on, its wealth and the division, sorry, its wealth and, there we go, that's better. Its wealth and the division between it and the rest of the regions of the UK is long-standing, and it's actually pulling further away. So what this gives us, I guess, in terms of funding and financing is a centralised economy and a system in terms of funding and financing transport schemes that's centralised on the area with the most economic power, that's beginning to pull further away. But let's not sort of beat around the bush here a little bit, because London is facing the same difficulties that the regions are. So the system is centralised, and that's having a similar effect on London and London's transport planning and London's funding opportunities as it is in the regions. So in this centralised system, what sort of factors are at play in terms of getting schemes approved? So I've put up here a sample of schemes that have been approved and not approved by the Department for Transport over the last few years, and I've included the benefit-cost ratio of those schemes. And so generally speaking, the higher the benefit-cost ratio, the higher the chance the scheme has of going ahead. However, you can see here, schemes have gone ahead with reasonable benefit-cost ratios in terms of Crossrail, the Jubilee Line extension, and Thameslink to a slightly lesser extent. But some major schemes that have not been taken forward have been the South Hampshire Tram and the Leeds Supertram. So there are other factors at play in terms of getting schemes funded, in addition to the BCR. And some of these factors, I feel, affect the regions perhaps more than the capital. So the capital, particularly in the UK context, tends to enjoy a local champion for the scheme. In some cases, for example, the Jubilee Line, there was also a local catalyst in the form of the Millennium and the Millennium Dome that led to the funding of the Jubilee Line. And also, the capital enjoys a proximity to where decisions are taken, and the schemes within London can also be said to have a contribution, I think, to the national economy of the country, which tends to be harder to make that case, I think, if you're a regional scheme. But importantly, and from my point of view, I think that the funding and the financing are also a factor. So the affordability of central government is a key factor. Sort of never mind the BCR, can we afford this or not? And local scheme promoters, in looking to make that affordability easier, can look to local sourcing as a way to take funding burden off central government's back in a centralised system. So we're going to look at Crossrail in a couple of slides' time again. And also, the other thing that I think is at play here is whether or not you're a test bed for innovative financing of funding can, I think, and this is not a result of statistical analysis, but can, I think, help you make a case to the Department for Transport for funding of the scheme. And the particular examples that I'm thinking of here are Nottingham, where the workplace parking levy was trialled, and Manchester TIF, where congestion charging was due to be trialled, but due to a referendum, did not actually happen. So, Crossrail. Crossrail is a new railway tunnel under London. It's Europe's largest construction project, and it's costing around £15 billion to fund. Depending on which way you look at it, just over half is going to be funded locally. And that local funding amounts partially to farebox funding and from loans taken out against TfL's wider farebox, from business rate supplements to the whole of London, and from submissions from developer contributions. So new developments are new developments and existing developments like Heathrow and Canary Wharf are being taxed through a community infrastructure levy and through a voluntary contribution, respectively. But there has been an additional phenomenon that was sort of impossible, I guess, to estimate at the time when Crossrail's funding package was being put together, and that is the effect of Crossrail on existing property prices. So the graph that we're looking at now shows the percentage uplift of property prices within half a mile of a Crossrail station, and those outside of the half-mile radius, and their uplift between 2005 and 2009 and 2013. And what this shows is that property prices within half a mile of a Crossrail station went up by 15% over and above the baseline in 8 years. And that additional value, so sort of bringing the property price up of an establishment, yields additional property tax revenue. So in putting together a financing and funding structure for Crossrail Line 2, what colleagues in London First and in TfL are suddenly doing is thinking, hey, I want a bit of this, let's see if we can let's see if we can use the money generated from existing property, remember that, not just new property, but existing property, and see if we can channel that into a funding stream and create an additional source of revenue for Crossrail 2. And so Crossrail 2 at the moment is looking to build on the success of Crossrail 1 and introducing lots and lots of local funding where possible, but if possible to have more local funding to make things easier for central government, and also to have more property-related funding. So this is Crossrail 2, and this is illustrative. This is something that is hot off the press. I think Bridget might well have been involved in this, but this is something that London First produced over the last few weeks that shows an illustrative makeup of how Crossrail 2 might be funded. And in terms of property taxes, London is looking to get control of its property taxes on a one-for-one basis and use them as a channel to then fund Crossrail 2 and successive infrastructure projects. So, getting hold of property taxes locally, well, what does that do for you? Well, it does two things. First of all, it allows you to keep that windfall identified on the previous slide. And secondly, it allows you to increase or decrease the property prices as you see fit. So you can either increase them generally, as the Mayor has done for Crossrail Line 1, across the whole of London, or you can increase them, and this is an especially sort of potent method, you can increase them very locally to the line, which also provides some additional funding. And the result for Crossrail Line 2 is a very mixed bag of funding that's mostly local and that I think is probably the most locally funded project of its time. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I think there are three things to note here. One is the extent to which fiscal devolution, so that's getting control of property taxes, can have in terms of the revenue that it can raise. So that's the salmon pink section of the graph at the top there, which shows indicatively you might be able to raise about £5 billion. The next thing is the extent to which the fare box is being relied on, and TfL has a large fare box and is looking to raise additional money from that fare box, potentially by putting fares up across London and drawing out loans that are then financed through that fare box. And then the final thing to note, I think, is despite all of this, is the extent to which central government still has a very large component. So I've grouped together the Network Rail and central government grants, and even in the Crossrail Line 2 context, which in my opinion, the extent to which central government might still be involved in funding. So as well as all of those options for financing and funding, there are many others. I think this slide is one probably for discussion at some stage after the meeting once you get all of your packs, because some of the opinions in here are quite subjective, and I don't propose to go through all of these things in general, but there are a few key points and a few key lessons I think that people have learned over the last few years. The first one is to beware the economic cycle. And also bear in mind political risk. So if we think about the Nottingham example, depending on who you speak to, I think the workplace car parking levy has either been a brilliant success or has had terrible externalities in terms of people parking on nearby streets and causing lots and lots of disruption for local residents. Secondly, I think the extent to which the fare box works and how fantastic the fare box is as a source of revenue and as a source of revenue that you can secure loans against, but that it works best where fares are already high, where the fare box itself is very well established and is very large, and where we have lots of inelastic flows. So that's where we have a large commuter base, and of course London is a perfect candidate for that. The final thing I think about this chart that I want to point out is the best ones, of course, from a political perspective and probably in terms of a scheme promoter perspective, are securing developer contributions and a community infrastructure levy. So if you are lucky enough to have either an airport or a large private sector and benefactor at either end of the line, or you're large enough to have, or you're lucky enough to have someone wanting to build houses at one of the stations on the line, you really are onto a winner. Penultimately now, the menu could be about to get larger. The fiscal devolution that's been earmarked for Crossrail 2 could well be unleashed on London and the regions, and in fact London has joined together with regional cities to campaign now for greater fiscal devolution. So what that means is that cities around the UK are hoping to get greater control over their property taxes. So not only be able to raise and lower them, but also have some sort of say-so about how they're spent. The other thing that cities are hoping to do is to lift the borrowing ceilings. So at the moment, cities are quite constrained by central government in how much they can borrow. They're campaigning to have those ceilings lifted so that they can, but still have them remain within a prudential limit. And name-checking Bridget again, she was part of the London Finance Commission report, which started all of this debate off. What that will do, crucially, is it will bring back money and power locally. So that gives cities more power to join up public services and more power to plan for future needs. And also, in the longer term, could enable cities to become financially self-sustaining, reducing demand on central government funding and also demand on central government public services. So, in summary, times are tough, but not that tough. And in a centralised system, in order for schemes to go ahead, there's a need for a political champion, and I would suggest also an innovative financing mechanism, an element of which could well be fiscal devolution. Crossrail 2 and local transport boards are building on the success of Crossrail 1, and there's been a move to much more local funding even between Crossrail lines 1 and 2, but there is still quite a large reliance on central government, and so the challenge for the next 20 years is how we move away completely from central government funding for local transport schemes, and indeed whether or not we think that is a desirable thing to do. Property taxes could well be key to that move away from central government funding. And on the local novel funding mechanisms, some of them are working better than others. I mentioned Nottingham before, but the political success and the success in the eyes of the electorate, I think, are key to this large, to which of those large menu of funding items actually survive for the next 10, 20 years and beyond. The city-centred campaign, which is for property tax devolution, gives cause for optimism, but it does mean that the menu for funding options is going to get larger. And a catalyst and some irrationality can help. And what I mean by that is having something like the Olympics or HS2 appear as a lever for central government to give you funding can help. And also harnessing irrationality of property developers that are eager to get one nose ahead of their rivals and not to miss the boat can also trigger contributions from them. And I'll leave you with this from Lord Heseltine now. And I say this as a former official at central government, but I'm sure many of my colleagues, two of which are here right now, would probably agree with me. Lord Heseltine said, "Big government does not work. Ministers and their officials are not that clever and events are not that predictable. Government must now reverse the trend of the past century and unleash the dynamic potential of our local economies." And what he's essentially saying here are that local decisions, the projects, the best and the most politically acceptable ways to fund and finance them, and the reputational risks if they fail, are probably more efficient if made locally rather than centrally. The end.